Hi, everybody. Welcome to SHCY Podcast, conversations between scholars from around the world who study childhood, youth, and related institutions historically. As an official production of the Society for the History of Children and Youth, you can subscribe to these shows through iTunes or Google Play. Written and visual materials associated with each episode are available at our website, SHCY.org. Enjoy.
Good evening. I'm speaking good evening for myself because here at the Eastern Shore there is an evening, and I can say good afternoon to Ainsley Morse, to my interlocutor. I'm Ilya Kukulin. I'm a research fellow of Amherst College, Amherst, Massachusetts, and I'm a scholar of Russian and some Eastern European literatures. And for me, this conversation is focused, first of all, on interconnection between children's literature in Russia, not only in Russia, in East Europe, and avant-garde poetry and avant-garde literature. And I'm speaking to Ainsley Morse, assistant professor of Dartmouth College, Dartmouth, New Hampshire. And as far as I understand, we have some very important intersection of our academic interests, because Ainsley is interested in children's poetry, not as only a specific segment of literature, but also as an important element of culture, from cultural studies of point of view, from anthropological point of view. Because for me, one of the most interesting aspects of scholarship of children's literature is that children's literature is very deeply connected with the imagination of given society about its future, and about imagination, not only imagination, but also children's literature allows to understand very deep emotional and social practices regarding the ties between generations, but regarding ruptures between generations and in also given society. And therefore, it would be very interesting to speak to Ainsley and to discuss with her two very interesting and important books, important in the academic field, published recently. First of them is the book Wordplay, Experimental Poetry and Soviet Children's Literature, published by Northwestern University Press in 2021, and a very new book, brand new, prepared by Ainsley, edited and translated, with Alexander Boshkovich, historian of Serbian literature and Serbian culture from Columbia University, professor of Columbia University. And together they prepared the first, as far as I understand, English edition with a very interesting and long forward edition of the poem by two Serbian poets, Alexander Vuce and Dusan Matic, that is depicted in the subtitle as a Yugoslav Marxist surrealist epic poem for children, written in 1933, as far as I remember.
Published in 1933. The poem was first written in 1931. Yeah.
Okay.
And the title, the English title is The Fine Feats of the Five Cockerels Gang.
Yes, and this book, including the foreword, the Serbian text, the English translation, and facsimile reproduction of the Serbian edition of the 1933 above mentioned is published by the editor by Brill. And now I'm asking, first of all, first of all, we will speaking about the first book, Wordplay, Experimental Poetry and Soviet Children's Literature, and what was the reasons of your, Ainsley, interest to children's literature and its interconnections with avant-garde, and how your book was conceived?
Thank you, Ilya. Thank you so much for agreeing to have this conversation with me. It's a great honor. When Ilya first read my book, he said, "Oh, I am so moved to see myself cited so many times." So I should say right away that Dr. Kukulin is a great inspiration to me, and his work is part of the answer to the question of how I came to write this book. So it's a great honor to have you as an interlocutor. I think that the story of the genesis of this book is actually very interesting, not to toot my own horn too much. It's not really me. It's just how things happened. Because although I came to agree wholeheartedly with what Ilya just said about the significance of children's literature in the wider context of culture, and the arts, and really, as Ilya also said, kind of from an anthropological perspective, thinking about such things, I did not start with children's literature. So to tell the story of the genesis of this book, it actually started with something that the book ends with, which is contemporary poetry from Russia in approximately the 2010s, maybe the first decade of the 2000s, when I started to be interested in contemporary poetry. And something that became a central idea of the book, which is this idea of a childlike aesthetic, was something that I noticed in contemporary poetry. So some of the poets whose work I started to follow and who I found really interesting, who were writing in the mid-2000s, early 2010s, I was picking up on these childlike elements in their work. Sometimes it was a sort of a childlike lyric persona. Sometimes it was childlike form, something that sounded kind of like a nursery rhyme. And sometimes it was kind of the trappings of childhood as part of the poem. And so I found this intriguing. And then my interest in contemporary poetry likewise led me into a very long-standing now interest in unofficial underground poetry of the Soviet period. So contemporary poetry in today's Russia, even now, but especially with the generation that are approximately my coevals, was very much coming out of this underground tradition. And so as I began to learn more about the underground tradition, I started noticing this childlike aesthetic in the work of quite a few poets there as well. And this is also when I found out that quite a few of the poets of the late Soviet period not only showed a childlike aesthetic in their work, they also worked as children's poets. So they were writing children's books as a kind of side gig. Very few of them were famous or successful as children's writers, which you could be famous and successful. Many of them were not, most of them were not. But it was an area that many of them were active in as freelancers. And it extended really, this is something I touch on probably less than I should in the book, but it extended to really cover a lot of other areas of underground culture. So many of them were friends with illustrators who likewise were the people illustrating children's books at the time. And so then, as I became intrigued by this phenomenon, I trace the history of it, and it takes me to actually the area where there probably has been the most research done by scholars in Russia and in the US and elsewhere, and that is the history of early Soviet children's literature. And because there has been so much more scholarship on this area, in the book, I don't have to go into it so much in depth. I kind of gesture toward it just to give historical background. But of course, this scholarship really does a great job of talking more about the idea of the child, of childhood, and the way in which children's literature is very closely tied to the idea of what the future is going to be like, as Ilya already said. So this was, however, arguably a unique moment in the various histories of children's literature, because Soviet society, as it was just forming, was basically articulating all of its many often contradictory ideals in the context of this brand new Soviet children's literature. And I think that this is I'll say one more thing, and then I'll turn the microphone back to Ilya, so that I'm not just giving a monologue. I basically have walked you through the way I wrote the book, but backwards at this point, because this is the structure that the book has. I begin with this really exciting and theoretically rich moment of the emergence of early Soviet children's literature, and its very open and complicated interactions with the avant-garde of the pre-Soviet and early Soviet period. And then I moved from there into the later Soviet underground and into the contemporary moment. But what I find is that, among the various things I find, the idea of what a child is and what childhood is, and how these ideas relate to, I guess, ideology and reality, which is often not the same thing. These ideas really change throughout the entire Soviet period. And so in some ways, there is a lot of continuity in the story that I tell about how this childlike aesthetic is conceived by early avant-garde modernist writers, and then kind of articulated through these different periods of early Soviet children's literature into the later period and post-Soviet. But at the same time, I think that ideas about what an actual child is like, what children need, what children mean for society, all of these ideas are actually changing throughout, even while some of the aesthetic decisions are staying the same. I will stop there as far as answering the question about where the idea came from, and we can move on. We can move on to some other questions.
Okay, thank you, and that was very interesting. And my second question regarding this book, Wordplay, is: did you present here your main argument, or is there something that is not explained in your previous monologue as what could be describe as the main argument of your book?
Yes, thank you. So the main argument of my book actually was, and is, a little bit polemical, mostly with regard to some of the very widely held notions about what is happening in unofficial poetry. And I'll say for listeners who are not you, Ilya, that when we say unofficial poetry, we're just talking about the vast amounts of poetry that were written during the Soviet period under pretty serious censorship and were not published. So mostly unofficial poetry, unofficial literature in general was not published because it was never submitted for publication. This is
And it
right.
was never submitted, not because mandatory of its political content, but also, first of all, because of its aesthetical specificity, because of its style.
Right. And it's an important distinction to make in order to properly lay out my argument. So unofficial literature is literature that was not published in the official Soviet press. But sometimes in Russian, we use the word kind of uncensored literature to emphasize that it was literature that wasn't necessarily rejected by the official Soviet press, but it was never submitted for review.
On the
right?
one hand, on the second hand, this therefore this literature was not a subject of self-censorship. That's its words.
Right, and that is a very important clarification, because I think that the standard view during the Cold War, and to a large extent even now, is that writers were heroically writing things and just being kind of squashed by the censoring body, or they were censoring themselves and just producing some kind of ideologically correct hogwash. So the poets whose work I examine in the book, for the most part, are poets who wrote in a way that I think we would describe as free. So they made their own aesthetic decisions. They had some kind of an audience of their peers and sometimes other people. They were able to share their work just on handwritten sheets of paper or typewritten sheets of paper, often in the form of samizdat. But it's obviously a different situation from a standard publishing circumstances that you might be familiar with in American or Western European contexts. And so the reason I'm giving this as background is that there is a concept that I bring up in the book, which is called Aesopian language. And Aesopian language is a reference to the fables of Aesop, which, especially since this is a podcast for people who care about children's literature, I imagine people are familiar with, the idea being that we're going to just tell you a nice story with some animal characters, but actually it's going to be a very incisive commentary on contemporary political, the contemporary political situation. And Aesopian language during the Soviet period becomes very widespread. It becomes a kind of doublespeak, is another phrase that is sometimes used. And the idea is that you kind of internalize, it is a form of self-censorship, but it is also a form of creative expression, right? You internalize the rules about what can and cannot be said, and you figure out how to say what you want to say through a sometimes rather convoluted system of hints, allusions, and otherwise. And when I began writing the book and doing research for the book, it was almost a kind of commonplace that I would encounter, that people would say, oh, Soviet children's literature is really great. It was the only place where people could speak freely. And the implication was that all kinds of political statements were being made in children's literature by the frustrated writers who could not make those statements openly in some other venue. And I mean, if you want, there's a famous book by the poet Lev Losyev called On the Beneficence of Censorship, in which he lays out this argument with reference to some early Soviet children's literature. Although actually, I guess he talks about Chukovsky's Tarakan, which is pre-Soviet, right? Anyway, so I was intrigued by this because I thought this is interesting and it's kind of appealing, but it's a very adult argument. And I thought maybe there are some other reasons that Soviet children's literature is really good, right? Maybe there are some reasons that are more aesthetic and not just subversive political. And so part of my aim in writing the book was to explore that angle. And I think that I found plenty of evidence in favor of my alternative viewpoint. Because what I was interested in was, on the one hand, people who wrote genuinely innovative and interesting and unexpected and surprising work for children, to kind of prove the point that Soviet children's literature was some of the best literature published in the Soviet Union. And I also really liked the idea, which is one of my main arguments in the book, that by engaging with children's literature, which meant different things for different writers, that maybe some of these poets were finding things in children's literature that were really useful to them in their so-called adult poetry. And that it was a two-way street. It wasn't just the frustrated adult trying to put adult messages into the children's literature. It was also the completely other way around, like people learning things from children's literature that would be aesthetically meaningful in adult literature. And the final piece of the argument for me that was most important for me is kind of embodied by a couple of the poets who I write about, including Daniel Harms in the early Soviet period, as well as Vsevolod Nekrasov and Ilya Grigoriev in the later period, poets who I present in the book as effectively ignoring the genre difference between children's literature and adult literature. Poets who ultimately think, you know what, like this is just how I write. I think that is, maybe it's kind of small scale, but for me, this was one of the more radical things that I found.
For me, as far as I understood your book, you don't write that there is absolutely no difference between, for example, children's and adult, so-called adult text within the works of, say, Ilya Grigoriev, but that these works have many common in style, in worldview, and can be they shape the common field of production of meanings, I think. If speaking about contemporary situation, I think that it would be important to say we are speaking about Russian literature situation of Russian aggression against Ukraine, and it's important to underscore that the most part of uncensored authors, unofficial authors, not all, but the most part, and their ancestors, their ears in Russian literature, today's young poets whose aesthetic genealogy would be traced back to unofficial literature, they usually resist to new Russian imperialist propaganda. They resist to military rhetorics, and some of them emigrated. And that's important that we are speaking about how to say non-imperialist part of Russian literature. And now we will soon we will return to the discussion of this book, World Play. Here I want to underscore that the word play is very important here. Play is something that unites the ideas of avant-garde, poetic avant-garde, and children's literature, especially for Russian children's literature of the 20th century was very rich with many word plays described in your books. Let's proceed to your next book, written.
Let me just say one other thing in response to your comment about the contemporary situation with Russia's war in Ukraine, because I will say something that has changed for me in relation to the book, really, since this more aggressive phase of the war began in February of 2022. I think that my attitude toward the idea of Aesopian language actually changed a little bit, because it's back. It's back, and it's back in children's literature. You know,
Yeah, I know.
There are some heroic contemporary publishers who are still operating in Russia right now. And obviously they can't publish anything about the war that addresses it directly, but they are publishing so many materials that relate to it indirectly. And I find this just on its own, I find this really fascinating and also utterly heroic. I mean, just to give a couple of examples, the publishing house called Samakat has been publishing a lot of books for children, picture books, graphic novels that are about different wars. They're about the Second World War, or I think even there was something about the war in Afghanistan, which seems like it would have been censored. And so I think that in a new, when I was writing this book, the situation with censorship in the Russian Federation was troubling and not to be ignored, but it wasn't what it is now. And it definitely has given me a somewhat different perspective on what children's writers were navigating, what all writers were having to navigate during the Soviet period. So I just wanted to add that before we move on.
All right, and I know at least one brilliant example of Aesopian language in the children's literature written during this stage of war, the poem by children's poet Artur Gevorgizov, describing the situation of Russian intellectuals during the war, as a situation of a too educated child in a yard full of hooligans, young hooligans.
I see.
And let's proceed. We will return to this matter. It's very important.
Yes.
But in order to connect your two different directions of your work, let's proceed to your next book, prepared with Professor Alexander Boshkovich, about the 5 feats of 5 Cockerel Gang. Please tell our listeners something about its authors, Alexander Vucho and Dusan Matic, and about this very poem, why it was interesting for you and how it could be compared with works of Soviet unofficial poets writing for children.
Thank you. Yes, so my background before I became a scholar of Russian language literature, I did quite a lot of work in Yugoslav literature. And so for me, doing this project with Sasha Bošković was very exciting to get back into something that I was very interested in, but quite a while ago. And in fact, most of the work, the academic work that I did on Yugoslav literature had to do with this Yugoslav avant-garde, which was, I guess, if you're thinking about a kind of classical modernist avant-garde, it was a bit later than the Russian/Soviet avant-garde. So the peak years are the mid to late 1920s and early 1930s. This avant-garde in Yugoslavia, as it was called at the time, was dominated by what was called surrealism. There was in particular...
Or in Russian, it's called nadrealism, literally over-realism.
And that's what it's called in Serbian too, nadrealism. But it was very closely related to the kind of original surrealism, if we can use that kind of term, because several of its most prominent representatives, including Dušan Matić, had studied in Paris. And so they had direct contact with the French surrealists. In fact, some of the primary venues for Yugoslav/Belgrade surrealism were, for instance, one of their biggest journals, an almanac, was in Serbian and French. It was published in two languages. So there was a lot of contact with the French variety of surrealism. And this book is a really fascinating hybrid. So the main text of the book, which I translated, is a long poem in 6 songs. We translated the word as pevanja, as songs. We could have done canto. It would be the same word if we had wanted a kind of Dante reference or something. And it was published in 1933 in a special publishing venture that was run by the Surrealist poets. It was called Éditions Surréalistes, so Surrealist Editions. And it was the text of a poem that Vuccio had published in just a daily newspaper a few years previously, accompanied by photo montage illustrations that Dušan Matić had made, as well as his very programmatic preface, which was not part of the original newspaper publication, and these very bizarre prose vignettes that accompany the photo montage illustrations. So, actually quite a few, so to immediately draw some parallels with things that you can read about in the book Wordplay we were just talking about. This is a great example of a very avant-garde work for children that is not necessarily all that child-oriented. And this is something characteristic of the early avant-garde in Russia/the Soviet Union. So that's something I talk about in just the introductory parts of Wordplay, where these modernist and avant-garde artists and writers are completely fascinated by and obsessed with the idea of the child and the idea of the child's perspective on the world, kind of a freshness and openness to the impossible, the absurd, what have you. But at the same time, the actual products that they are producing are not necessarily all that child-oriented. And this is the case this is one of the things that makes the Fine Feats of the Five Cockerels Gang, the Yugoslav poem, makes it really interesting because it's overtly attempting to address children. And the poem, the actual text of the poem, I think is very successful as a work of children's literature. While I was translating it, I regularly read it to my small children, and they approved and were captivated. And it has a lot of action. It has a gripping plot. which I can say a few words about in a minute. But again, the way that it was published as a very small print run surrealist editions with these kind of macabre illustrations and difficult to understand texts. These factors are not, they don't go over as well with younger readers. So it's really a kind of hybrid. It also gets back to what Ilya began with, talking about in society, like the idea of what a child is and what childhood should be, because the programmatic preface to the poem that Dusan Matic writes does address children and addresses them basically as the oppressed workers, and calls out for them to toss off the yoke of adult ways of thinking about the world, which he equates with oppressive capitalism and stuff like that. And I don't know, I mean, I find it, as an adult, I find it compelling. But in some ways, it's a similar kind of projection of really the way we want society to be as a whole onto this kind of figure of the child as an innocent and unspoiled and all of these things. So I sort of jumped right into some of the theoretical angles surrounding this work without saying much about it. I'll just say briefly that the plot of the long poem, that really is the bulk of the work. I mean, there are only 5 photo illustrations that accompany it. So the plot is that there are these 5 kids, these 5 boys, who are, it's indicated by their style of speaking that they come from worker families. They're not like noble lads. And they are kind of street kids, like, you know, they have homes, but they mostly just hang out playing with each other in the street. And then this is why they're called the 5 Cockerels Gang. That's just a name that they made up for themselves. And they encounter a young girl who is being, as they perceive it, who is being held captive in this institution near a place that they like to play. And this is one of the actually overtly surrealist elements of the poem, because you never really can tell. The institution is either a convent, and it is in fact run by nuns, but it is also referred to as the State Institute for Girls. So it is one of quite a few moments in the poem where there is an implicit critique of the union of church and state, which was typical of the Yugoslav monarchy that was in charge at the time, and that was directly oppressing this group of poets. Anyway, so they find out that this girl is being held captive there by all of these evil nuns who are very evil and disgusting, very effective villains. And they organize a couple attempts to rescue her, which fail. And then finally, they figure out this grand plan of rescuing her by getting a lampshade maker to build them a hot air balloon. And they successfully rescue her using this hot air balloon. And then they sail off with her to an island. And one of the many cool things about this poem is that almost all of the details, like where things are, the names of shops and stuff like this, the location of this island, they're real places in Belgrade. So especially for kids at the time who were reading it, like in the newspaper version, they would have said, oh yeah, I know where that is. I know where that is. So they defeat the most evil nun of all, who's called Sister Calavestra. And they have a absolutely utopian ending where they are basically going to build a completely new society on this island that they
on the very recognizable island on the Danube, just within the city limits of Belgrade.
Yep, exactly.
Uh, yes, I think that this poem is very impressive, and I think that it's also accompanied with a foreword by Dusan Matic, who was a poet and an artist who made these photo montages. And while reading this foreword, I was thinking about that this, we would say that this poem, this long poem, is not only Marxist, it's Freudian Marxist.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Good point.
because it's one of most striking. I was I grown up in the Soviet Union, and while being at school and at the university, I had to read many Marxist charged books, but without any traces of psychoanalysis, you understand. And for me, I know about Wilhelm Reich, or I don't know, Erich Fromm, some other Freudian Marxists, but connection of psychoanalysis and Marxism in children's literature impressed me strongly, frankly speaking. And I think that you see that the notion of child in different cultures differs strongly, because in the Soviet Union, you could distinguish between at least two types of children's literature, two ideal types, if using Max Weber's terms. First ideal types, it was propagandist children's literature, which addressed to children as tabula rasa, as somebody empty who should become the new man or woman for the new society. And second was more or less unofficial children's literature, more marked with the idea of play than this propagandist literature. And that's interesting that children's literature, propagandist type, was very rich with photo montages and photo collages. In the 2021, the book by the professor of Princeton University in the USA, Sergei Ushakin, was published in Moscow, which was called Medium for Masses, Consciousness Through the Eyes, Medium для масс, сознание через глаз in Russian. That this book is the very thorough analysis of the children's propagandist books based on idea of montage, but this is very not so poetic montage, and as in the book by Alexander Vucher and Dusan Matic. This is obviously politically charged montage focused on figure of Lenin.
It's, I mean, one of the really interesting considerations about the fine feats of the Five Cockerels gang is that the schema that I laid out when I was describing wordplay about this early Soviet period, and then these kind of more straightforwardly oppressed underground writers of the later Soviet period, it's kind of reversed in the Yugoslav context. So
absolutely,
when Matic and Vucho are writing this, they are essentially underground writers. And this work was being censored and seized and destroyed, and several of their friends were arrested. And subsequently, however, it's so fascinating to see how it worked out. But since after the Second World War, the Yugoslav partisans won and Yugoslavia became a socialist state, Actually, Matic, Vucho, and quite a few other prominent figures of that former underground became absolutely mainstream, basically leaders of the literary establishment in post-war Yugoslavia.
Members of the Union of Communists of Yugoslavia.
Yeah. Just at all the tribunes and so on. They didn't go on to they didn't work anymore with Montage. They also didn't, I mean, they both continued to write, but they didn't do any further work for children after that point. And so it is because something that I didn't say, but that I probably should mention about wordplay, which has to do with something you and I have discussed earlier, with this idea of the weak subject in poetry, because one of the more, I don't know, sociological aspects that I explore in wordplay is the status of children's literature in relation to the literary establishment, to the wider field of literature. And in the Soviet Union, even in the very early period when children's literature was accorded a lot of attention and there was a lot of discussion of what it should be like, because of, as you said, this idea that children are a blank slate that we can just work with to create the ideal new person, unlike all of these flawed adults with their pre-revolutionary baggage. So on the one hand, children's literature seemed really important, but even in the early Soviet period, it was still much lower prestige than being an adult writer. And it was something that, a very prominent figure in children's literature, Samuel Marshak, he talks about this at these, all union meetings of writers. And he says, he tries to convince people that writing children's literature is really important, and that I'm sure you know about his speech called Big Literature for Little People, right? Большая литература для маленьких, right? Like, meaning like great literature for young people. And in the later Soviet period, the status of children's literature becomes even more noticeably diminished, or it was really great.
The status of children's writers.
Right. Yes, I'm sorry. You are absolutely right. That is an important distinction. And so I do talk about that sociological fact, right? The status of children's writers. I talk about that in relation to some of the lyric speakers who crop up in the poems, not necessarily written for children, by the poets whose work I discuss in the book. Because I think that in some ways, this lower status entailed greater freedom, because who cares what you're doing? You're just a lowly children's writer. And in other ways, I think it I don't know, consolidated a lot of the complexes that were that were in the air. And so for me, it's something that I do see as related, even aesthetically, to some of the positions that are explored by these poets. And you mentioned earlier, when you talked about the connection with the war in Ukraine, you mentioned how important it is that we're talking about a tradition of Russian language literature that is deeply not imperialist, right? It's a tradition of Russian literature that absolutely refuses the idea of greatness.
Yes,
right? To tie it into an American narrative as well, right? And this is no small task in the context of Soviet literature, which is all about greatness, right? I mean, or Soviet culture.
Absolutely. And the significant part of the Soviet children's literature was about children's heroes. And here, this is to deal with literature for and about children, but not about heroism.
Right, exactly. And in the Yugoslav context, and in the context of the book we've been discussing, the five fine feats of the Five Cockerels gang, there you have a really different attitude toward what heroism means, because the writers are writing from the position of underdog, right? So these boys are depicted as heroic, and in some ways their struggle is a eternal epic kind of David and Goliath struggle with this enormous convent and absolutely evil nuns. But it really doesn't resemble, if we're gonna stick with calling it Marxist, right? It really doesn't resemble the kind of heroism that is depicted in a lot of the early or contemporary Soviet children's literature.
Absolutely, and here I think that it would be interesting to clarify this specificity of this heroism in poem by Alexander Vucha and Dusan Matic through the figure of vulgarized Nietzscheanism. The American historian of culture, Bernice Rosenthal, she analyzed that for Bolshevism, for Soviet Bolshevism, the vulgarized idea of Nietzscheanism understood via works of Maxim Gorky, the great, the great socialist writer, founder, one of the main founders of Soviet literature, that Gorky was full of idea of vulgarized Nietzscheanism, understood not in sense of play, not also very important for Nietzsche, but through idea of puffed up greatness. And
okay,
all these books, all these texts you are analyzing, both Russian and Serbian, are absolutely devoid of this puffed up rhetoric, puffed up greatness. And here I'm thinking, are they connected with some other European traditions? While reading Foreword by Dusan Matic, connecting the Freudian and Marxist rhetoric, I was thinking about one more Central European author, namely Italian children's writer, also admirer of both Marx and Freud, Gianni Rodari.
Rodari. That's really interesting. Yeah, I didn't think of that, but I will definitely look into
rhetoric of Dusan Matic resembles rhetoric of especially early Rodari, who was also very, and partially maybe some of his late books, grammar of fantasy. That Gianni Rodari has had his own program of child rearing based on Marxism and psychoanalysis, and also idea of how to say emancipation of desires, as it was described in foreword to this.
Right. One other
of desires.
One other, just before I forget, thinking comparatively about this Yugoslav and then the more mainstream propagandistic early Soviet children's literature, it occurred to me that pretty early on in the propagandistic branch of Soviet children's literature, you have obviously lots of depictions of collectives. but it's important that there is like a strong leader, right? If you think about some of these collectives. And one of the things that I found immediately very appealing and striking about the Five Cockerels gang is that they are really they strike me as more of a collective. They have someone who is sort of called a captain, but he is not the one making all the decisions. And each of their rescue attempts is very much a kind of collage of participation on everybody's part. So that's kind of an interesting, another interesting angle in terms of really orthodox ideas about socialism, right? Which very quickly become quite quite devolved in the Soviet context.
I think, sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm thinking that Soviet theorists of pedagogy in the 1930s, while having read this book by Alexander Vucci and Dusan Matic, Five Cockerels, they would have called it anarchists, not anarchists.
Yes, surely, surely. Yes, but I also didn't want to forget about the thing you said about Gianni Rodari and this curious Marxist Freudian combination. I think as further encouragement to everyone to read this wonderful Yugoslav poem, something really striking that Dusan Matic writes at the end that I think is just very much advice that still stands today or something like this. It's a surrealist argument for making collages, but it projects the idea of cutting out the pictures that you like and turning them into a new reality onto life more generally. It's a very powerful statement that the preface closes with.
Dusan Matic proposes, and Alexander Vucci as well, liberation of imagination as a main tool against human alienation caused by division between poor and rich. For me, this idea that the imagination is the main tool and main space for social revolution. The social revolution, first of all, is a transformation of thought. This idea is much closer to me than idea of violent revolution.
Yeah.
I'm not Marxist, but I understand. This is understandable Marxism for me.
So we don't have a lot of time left.
Yes.
I thought maybe I don't know, what should we conclude on some particular
Yes.
note, or maybe we should conclude with what you just said.
I would finish with one question. How could you imagine, if speaking on imagination, the continuation of your work? What would be interesting for you to make, to endeavor as the continuation of your work in study of interconnections between avant-garde and unofficial literature and children's literature?
Thank you. So the short answer is that I have continued. I did another project actually with Sasha Boshkovich, who we worked with on the Yugoslav book, but we wrote a paper together about Soviet children's literature. And we actually approached the question of surrealism, a kind of surrealism there, because we talked about early Soviet children's books that also work with photo montage. So I feel like one of the strengths of the book is the way that it offers a pretty huge historical panorama to readers, because I trace this childlike aesthetic over so much time. However, I think this is also a weakness of the book, because each of the periods that I discuss is so rich and deserves so much more attention. So for instance, it was very difficult to choose the 5 poets from the late Soviet period whose work, well, the discussion of their work forms the bulk of the book. This is Всеволод Nekrasov, Igor Kholin, Leonid Aranzon, and Alia Grigoriev, as well as Dmitry Prigov, as a kind of a coda. And I do continue to work with each of them, as well as many other poets of this period, trying to further sort out the questions that I feel like I just begin to pose in the book. I think that the question of liberation that you just brought up in the Yugoslav context, the idea of a kind of aesthetic and ideological anarchism that maybe we see in the 5 Cockerels gang. I would like to find more things that feel like that in the Soviet context, or to convince myself that they cannot be there. I'm quite intrigued by that, by the possibilities that this kind of comparative glance opens up. And finally, I continue to be interested in contemporary poetry, including the really interesting and largely devastating work that is being written right now by people in Russian. And I am curious to see how what seems like kind of a perennial usefulness of this childlike aesthetic, I wonder if we are going to see it in some of the ways that people are working through a really serious reckoning with imperialism, greatness, puffed up self-importance, and so on, which is so much of what we see at the official level in Russia right now.
And I think that you're, as a scholar of Russian culture, strongly concerned with today's events. I think that your work is very important for reconsideration of Russian culture and for clarifying of those tendencies and those movements in Russian culture that can be basis for the future Russian culture that would be liberated from these ideas of jingoism and imperialism. Thank you so much, and
let's hope. Yes, thank you.
I thank you for our very interesting conversation, and I wish you the success in your work.
Thank you so much, Ilya. Good night.
Thank you for listening to SHCY Podcasts. You can find more materials and features from the Society for the History of Children and Youth online, SHCY.org.